They were only supposed to collect evidence. A standard assignment in an old rotting house at the edge of town, after neighbors complained of a stench rising from the basement. 5 forensic specialists entered that morning, carrying cameras, gloves, and steady hands trained to handle horror. By afternoon, only one man staggered back out. He was covered in blood that wasn't his own, eyes wide and unfocused, lips trembling as if trying to form words that simply wouldn't come. Since that moment he has never spoken again. Local authorities tried to keep it quiet, filing reports under vague labels and sanitizing the details for the press. But rumors have a way of seeping through cracks, especially in small towns. Some say it was a crime scene too grisly to comprehend. Others whisper of dark shapes moving just beyond flashlight beams, of faint voices calling from behind walls, of something ancient and hungry that woke when the team broke the silence of that house. Whatever truth lives there, it left one man hollowed out, trapped in a private terror he cannot share. This is the story of Hollow Creek Lane, of the team that thought they were prepared for anything, and of the evil that made sure only one of them ever left to remember it. Chapter 1. The Door That Waited. It started with a call that should have been routine. The local police department had received multiple complaints from neighbors about a nauseating odor drifting from the old house at 47 Hollow Creek Lane. People in town had always avoided that place, whispering about strange lights at night, about crying that seemed to slip through the cracked windows on windless evenings. They told stories about the family that once lived there, how the father had vanished without a trace, how the mother was found drowned in the bathtub, how the children simply seemed to stop existing one by one. But ghost stories are easy to invent, especially in small towns hungry for secrets. The official report was simple enough. There was a smell. Something rotting. Maybe an animal that crawled in to die. So they sent in the forensic team. 5 professionals who had all seen things that would haunt the average person forever. They were accustomed to death in all its hideous forms, bloated corpses under bridges, skeletal remains dug up by accident during renovations, grisly crime scenes left behind by people whose motives no sane mind could comprehend. It was work that required a certain deadening of the senses, a practiced numbness that kept the horror at bay. On the drive over they kept things light. Rodriguez, the youngest of them, joked about how it was probably just some drunk who'd keeled over with his cats. $10 says we'll find a litter box the size of a coffin, he laughed. Harris, the team lead, grunted. His sense of humor had dried up years ago, but even he didn't seem worried. No one did. Not yet. That changed the moment they pulled up to the property. The house loomed behind a gate so rusted it seemed to bleed onto the weeds tangled at its base. The yard was a chaos of thorny vines and dark, waxy leaves that clung to the porch like they were trying to pull the structure back into the earth. The windows were filthy, streaked with brown and gray, and behind the grime it almost looked like something was pressed up against the glass, watching. As they stepped onto the porch, the smell struck them, heavy and syrupy, crawling up into their sinuses, clinging to the back of their throats. It was unmistakable, the deep, cloying odor of decomposition. But there was something else beneath it, an undercurrent that made Harris's skin prickle. It reminded him of damp iron, of blood too old to be fresh and too recent to be dust. Inside, the floorboards groaned under their boots, each step releasing tiny puffs of dust that danced in the pale light seeping through half-draped windows. Wallpaper hung in long, curling strips, revealing patches of dark mold that seemed to pulse slightly as if breathing. In the living room, an old armchair sat facing away from them. Rodriguez gave it a playful nudge with his foot, half expecting some mummified occupant to slump over. It was empty, but left a perfect dark outline on the floorboards, as though someone had indeed sat there for decades without moving. They moved room to room, cataloging the decay. It was standard procedure. Take photos, note any signs of forced entry or foul play. But the deeper they went, the more the air seemed to resist them, thickening until each breath felt like swallowing damp wool. Tiny sounds played at the edge of hearing, a faint rustle, a distant creak, something like a sigh. At first, they chalked it up to the natural protests of an old house disturbed by new footsteps. But as they progressed, the noises took on a shape that gnawed at them. The scuttling in the walls seemed to follow them. Twice, Harris caught movement just outside the beam of his flashlight, small, quick, deliberate. Then they found the hallway that ended in a door standing slightly ajar. It was narrow, the walls pressing close with moisture-slick wallpaper. As they approached, the odor intensified until even their seasoned stomachs churned. Harris was first to reach it. The door was old, its paint bubbled and flaking, hinges spotted black with corrosion. From beyond it came a breath of cold that smelled of earth and wet stone. And beneath it all, something coppery and sharp. Basement? Harris muttered, voice dry. He slipped on a fresh pair of gloves, gesturing for the others to ready their kits. Rodriguez gave a nervous chuckle. Bet you wish you'd taken that desk job now, huh? No one laughed. Harris pushed the door fully open. Darkness sprawled beyond, a yawning mouth of shadow swallowing the narrow wooden steps that disappeared into nothing. Their flashlights cut tentative paths, barely penetrating the gloom. As they stood there, a sudden hush fell, so complete that it felt alive, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Rodriguez shivered. "Feels wrong," he whispered. Harris didn't respond. He simply drew a long breath, bracing himself, then started down. One by one, the others followed, each step creaking with the reluctant weight of men who suddenly realized they were not as numb to dread as they liked to believe. And at the bottom of those steps, the waiting truly began. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Dark. The basement swallowed them one by one. Their flashlights bobbed uncertainly as they descended, slicing through columns of dust that floated like ghostly threads. The stairs groaned underfoot, some steps flexing alarmingly as if threatening to give way and send them all tumbling into the black. Harris led the line, his breath steady but his shoulders rigid. Each of them had seen enough to know that sometimes fear was a sharper warning than logic. At the bottom the air changed. It was colder here, damp against their skin, carrying a smell so pungent it felt almost oily. The light revealed stone walls slick with condensation, streaked in places with something darker that refused to reflect. Their boots left shallow impressions in a thin layer of gray dust coating the floor. The dust seemed to quiver after they stepped through it, as if trying to close over their tracks. Rodriguez let out a slow whistle. "Place is a goddamn crypt," he muttered. His words fell strangely flat, swallowed by the thick air. Behind him, Miller shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward a corner where their lights hadn't reached. They began their methodical sweep. Cameras clicked, flashes bursting against the walls, illuminating patches of old water damage and strange, sprawling patterns that looked almost like veins. Harris crouched to examine a pile of debris, rotted wood, shattered glass, fragments of something white. Bone. He picked up a shard with tweezers, turning it under his flashlight. It was small, jagged, suspiciously like part of a rib. "Bag it," he said curtly, and Miller moved to comply. That was when Rodriguez flinched violently. He spun around, nearly losing his footing on the slick floor. "Did you?" He stopped, swallowing hard. Someone just whispered my name." Harris shot him a hard look. "Keep it together." "No, seriously," Rodriguez insisted. His eyes were wide, darting from shadow to shadow. "Right behind me. Clear as day. Said my name like it was right at my ear." They all stood still then, the kind of stillness that's almost painful. Straining to hear. Nothing came, just the slow drip of water from some unseen pipe, landing in a rhythmic plink that suddenly sounded far too much like breathing. They pressed on. The basement seemed to stretch farther than it should have. Twice they turned corners that led into cramped offshoot rooms, little more than dirt pits shored up with rotting beams. In one they found piles of clothing reduced to rags. In another, the remains of a child's wooden rocking horse, its paint eaten away by mold, one eye still faintly visible under layers of grime. It stared at them accusingly as they passed. Rodriguez kept close to Harris now, one hand hovering near his holstered sidearm even though there was no one living here to shoot. Every so often he'd jerk his head, as if catching some movement in his peripheral vision. The others weren't much better. Even Miller, who prided himself on his detachment, had begun to flinch at small sounds, shoulders creeping up toward his ears. Then they entered what appeared to be the largest chamber yet. Their lights crawled over low shelves covered in clutter, old mason jars sealed with dark sludge, tarnished cutlery, stacks of mildewed newspapers. A sagging table stood at the center, and on it was a carefully arranged collection of objects that made their stomachs twist. Small bones, bundles of hair tied with twine, nails rusted to a deep brown. At the far edge of the table, someone, or something, had scrawled symbols into the wood. Rough, looping shapes that seemed to squirm under their flashlights. Harris reached out, tracing one of the carvings with his gloved fingertip. His breath caught in his throat, a sudden sharp inhalation. "These are fresh," he said, voice low. Rodriguez backed away. "Fresh? Who the hell's been down here?" Before Harris could answer there was a sound. Soft at first, like fabric brushing over stone. Then clearer. A whisper that rose just above the silence, threading through the room so intimately it felt like it was inside their ears. Not words exactly, but a string of soft, coaxing syllables. A tone that suggested laughter or perhaps weeping. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Rodriguez clapped his hands over his ears. "Stop it," Stop it, make it shut up. The lights flickered. Harris swung his beam wildly, catching Rodriguez's face twisted in terror, eyes squeezed shut. Then just as quickly as it began, the whispering stopped. The silence returned so abruptly it thudded in their skulls. Rodriguez was breathing hard, tears standing in his eyes. It said it wanted one of us to stay. Harris tightened his grip on the flashlight. We're finishing this sweep and getting the hell out. No one argued. They gathered their samples in silence, carefully avoiding the table as though proximity alone might invite something to follow them. As they prepared to retrace their steps back to the stairs, Harris paused. He could have sworn he saw a faint glow pulse through one of the symbols carved into the table. It was gone when he blinked, leaving only a memory of cold that crept up his spine and settled at the base of his skull. They started back through the twisting maze of rooms, the echo of that whisper trailing them like a scent. And somewhere behind them, in the darkness, something moved, slowly, patiently, as if it knew the house was in no rush. After all, it had waited this long already. Chapter 3, The Room No Light Could Touch. Their retreat through the basement was a silent, tense procession. Each man's flashlight beam cut across old stone and damp earth, every flicker of shadow feeling like a deliberate threat. They spoke little now, too afraid that their own voices might drown out something they desperately needed to hear. Footsteps that weren't theirs or the faint scrape of nails along the wall. As they navigated the narrow corridor back toward the stairs, Harris noticed something that made his breath hitch. The passage was longer than he remembered. He stopped, swept his light in slow arcs across the walls. They looked the same slick stone, same mold-dark streaks, but there were more of them now. An extra turn here, a door frame that hadn't been there before. Miller nearly collided with him. "Why'd you stop?" Miller hissed, his own voice hushed by instinct rather than any plan. This isn't right," Harris said under his breath. He checked his watch without really seeing it, thumbed the side of his flashlight like it might be malfunctioning. "It's twisting us around." Rodriguez gave a small, panicked laugh. "Basements don't move, Harris. We're just—" He didn't finish. His light had landed on something ahead, a doorway partially hidden by hanging rags that might once have been curtains. The fabric twitched slightly, though there was no draft. Beyond, the darkness looked different, somehow thicker, almost glossy. Like a pool of oil waiting to swallow whatever dared step through. Harris felt an irrational compulsion to turn back, to herd them all out immediately, no samples, no evidence. Just get out. But duty, and a gnawing curiosity he couldn't quite suppress, drove him forward. He pushed the rags aside. They were damp and left dark streaks on his gloves. Then he stepped through. The room beyond swallowed the flashlight beam. It was like shining into pitch, no reflection, no scatter of dust motes. Just utter, oppressive black. Miller stepped in after him, frowning. "My light's dead," he whispered, even though the torch still burned in his hand. Its beam simply didn't pierce more than a foot ahead. The darkness seemed to drink it down. Rodriguez hovered in the doorway. "Don't like this. Don't. Something's wrong with the air." And it was. Each breath felt heavier here, syrupy and cold. Harris tried to focus on the shapes closest to him, rusted shelves, a toppled trunk. But everything seemed slightly out of focus, like viewing through warped glass. He felt a pressure in his ears, a soft pop, as though the room existed at a different altitude. Then came the whispering again. Closer now, circling them, rising and falling like the lull of distant surf. Words lapped at the edges of comprehension. Harris turned in slow circles, trying to pinpoint the source. Each time he thought he saw movement, a shift in the wall, a pulse of darker black, he found nothing when he aimed the light directly at it. Rodriguez let out a sharp whimper. Harris spun to see him backing away, nearly tripping over a broken stool. "It's right there," Rodriguez rasped, hands shaking as he pointed. "Standing next to you." Harris swung the flashlight but caught only emptiness. The whisper rose again, and this time it sounded almost playful, almost kind. He realized with a fresh spike of terror that it was saying his name. Softly. Repeatedly. A sound like breath exhaled through teeth. "Harris? Harris?" Miller had turned pale, sweat trickling along his hairline despite the chill. "We need to get out." "No. Before it." A noise cut him off. A wet, tearing sound like meat being pulled from bone. Then something slid across the floor just beyond their lights. A shadow among shadows, long-limbed and wrong, gliding over the stones without disturbing so much as a scrap of dust. Rodriguez screamed. Not a startled cry but a deep, animal wail of horror. He bolted for the doorway, shoving aside the hanging rags so forcefully they tore. The other two followed on instinct, crashing back into the narrow hallway, gasping for breath as though they'd surfaced from underwater. Behind them, the whispering didn't stop. It only grew softer, fonder somehow, as if amused by their panic. Harris caught one last phrase, a sweet murmur that crawled straight down his spine. Someone always stays. They didn't slow. Not to look back, not to check if the passage had changed again. They simply ran, guided by the desperate hope that somewhere ahead lay the stairs, and above that, the fragile mercy of daylight. By the time they stumbled into the original basement chamber, chest heaving, hands slick with sweat inside their gloves, Harris risked a glance behind them. The doorway they'd fled from was gone, just a blank stretch of damp stone wall. As if the room had never existed. Or perhaps it still did, but only when it wanted to. Miller doubled over, coughing so hard he nearly vomited. Rodriguez had sunk to his knees, muttering fragments of prayers. Harris could only stand there, feeling something like hands pressing against his chest from inside, pushing him gently backward, urging him not to return. But he knew the house was far from finished with them. And the worst was still waiting. Chapter 4. One man returned. By the time they stumbled back through the basement toward the narrow stairs, all sense of procedure had vanished. Their kits were half forgotten, evidence bags discarded along the damp floor. The whispering still trailed them, sometimes a chorus of low voices, sometimes a single tone that dripped with dreadful affection. It felt like being followed by invisible fingertips, brushing lightly over their necks, their shoulders, tracing their spines as if memorizing them. Rodriguez was nearly incoherent, tears streaking his cheeks. He kept shaking his head, hands clamped over his ears even though it did nothing to muffle the voices. Miller was no better, hunched over and breathing in shallow gasps, eyes flicking wildly at every shadow. Harris tried to lead them, forcing his own trembling legs to keep moving. But with each step, a terrible certainty grew inside him, that the basement had no intention of letting all of them leave. They reached the bottom of the stairs. Harris was already half up when he noticed Miller had stopped. The younger man stood frozen, staring back into the gloom with an expression so blank it was like someone had hollowed him out. "Miller," Harris barked, but it came out a ragged croak. "Move. We're leaving." Miller didn't seem to hear. His mouth moved slightly, forming silent words. Then his eyes rolled up, lids fluttering. He let out a small sigh, almost peaceful, and crumpled backward into the dark. Rodriguez let out a strangled sound and darted up the steps, practically knocking Harris aside. Harris twisted to look down after Miller, but the shadows at the foot of the stairs had already swallowed him completely. For a breathless second, he thought he saw hands, long, thin, almost delicate, curl out of the darkness, wrapping around Miller's shoulders and drawing him gently away. Then nothing. They burst into the ground floor. The air here seemed hot by comparison, though it still reeked of mold and rot. The front door stood wide open, weak daylight pouring in. Harris grabbed Rodriguez by the arm and all but dragged him through it. Outside, on the overgrown lawn, Rodriguez collapsed. He pressed his face into the dirt and sobbed, fists clenched so tight his knuckles were bloodless. Harris stood over him, gulping huge breaths, eyes fixed on the house. Even from here it seemed to lean toward them, windows dark and watchful. A faint shape moved past an upstairs window, though the house was supposed to be empty. He couldn't bring himself to wonder if that was Miller, or what was left of him. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone must have heard them screaming. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, mouths tight with fear. They knew, everyone in Hollow Creek knew, that the house took what it wanted. They just never expected it to take a forensic team in broad daylight. Later, after police arrived and found Harris and Rodriguez in shock, after they failed to locate Miller at all despite combing the basement for hours, the real horror began to show itself. Rodriguez's mind didn't survive that basement. In the back of the ambulance, he rocked and moaned, eyes glazed. By the time they reached the hospital, he had clawed so violently at his own ears that he severed part of one lobe. He died 2 days later, seizures snapping his body like a puppet on cut strings. That left only Harris. He sat upright on the stretcher, staring straight ahead. When paramedics spoke to him, he did not respond. When doctors tried to question him, he didn't blink. His vitals were steady, no physical damage apart from shallow scratches on his arms that might have been defensive wounds. But whatever had happened in the dark of that house had cored him out, leaving only the shell. Weeks later, they moved Harris to a private psychiatric facility. Occasionally, attendants found him standing by the window of his room, looking up at the moon with tears spilling soundlessly down his cheeks. Once, a nurse swore she heard him whisper something so faint she thought she might have imagined it. Still waiting. No one dared ask him who was waiting or where. Epilogue: Silence forever. The house at 47 Hollow Creek Lane stands where it always has, hunched beneath tangled trees, its roof lines sagging like tired shoulders. From the street, it looks no different than it did that day the forensic team arrived. Broken windows, flaking paint, ivy clawing up the porch posts. A ruin among other, quieter ruins in a town that learned long ago to pretend such places were only homes and not hungry mouths. After the incident, authorities boarded up the doors and nailed thick plywood across the windows. A flimsy attempt to declare the matter closed. No official statement ever explained what happened to the team inside. The files remained sealed, locked away under language so cold and bureaucratic it all but erased the horror. Personnel loss under investigation. Pending internal review. But people talk. Stories leaked out in fractured retellings. From the paramedics who wheeled Rodriguez away while he shrieked about whispers under his skin, to the orderly who first tried to feed Harris and found him smiling vaguely at the wall, like someone sharing a private joke with the shadows. Neighbors claim that at night if you walk past the house very slowly, you'll see lights moving inside. Pale, wandering shapes that drift from room to room. Some say you can hear laughter too, low and muffled as if it's coming from deep underground. A few kids even dared each other to press their ears to the boards nailed over the front door. Most ran away screaming after only a second. One boy stood there longer, listening so intently that his friends had to drag him back. He wouldn't say what he heard. Now he won't go near that block, crossing the street with his eyes squeezed shut. As for Harris, he never left the facility. The doctors stopped trying after months of silence. They called it catatonia, though sometimes at night a nurse would find him pacing his room, tracing invisible symbols on the window glass with a trembling finger. Once he was discovered standing on his bed, head tilted back, whispering so quietly they had to lean close to catch it. The words were simple, chilling in their vacancy. Can't hear them anymore. When pressed, he offered no explanation. By morning he was sitting on the floor, rocking slowly, as if to comfort himself against some cold that only he could feel. No family ever came for him. Friends from the force visited once or twice out of obligation, but found the hollow look in his eyes too much to bear. Over time, even the staff began to avoid his room whenever possible. They couldn't explain why, only that stepping over the threshold made them feel watched by something that wasn't Harris. Years have passed. New families moved into the neighborhood around Hollow Creek Lane, unaware or willfully ignorant of the house's reputation. Children grew up hearing scraps of old rumors, cautionary tales meant to keep them away. Yet every so often, a window on the second floor will glow faintly for just a moment, like a lantern passing behind a curtain. Or a voice will drift out on the wind, so soft it's almost gentle, calling a name no one recognizes. Still, the boards remain in place. No one has dared to pry them off, no realtor has been brave or foolish enough to list it. The grass out front is waist high, and the gate continues its slow collapse into the dirt. But the house itself waits, patient as ever. Because something inside it knows that eventually someone will come. A city inspector sent to document the decay, a lost traveler looking for shelter from the rain, or perhaps just a curious teenager who can't resist seeing if the old stories are true. And when that happens, the house will open itself once more. It will breathe them in, fill their ears with tender murmurs, and wrap around their hearts with long, cold fingers. Until they too belong to it, silent forever, yet never truly alone.